Everyone, thanks for joining. You are joining the Strategos webinar on post-election education implications. Tom, it's been a fun one. Let's dive in.
Yeah, I think, Doug, I think you and I were talking the other day, if we would have had this conversation last Monday and tried to do some more detailed preparation, all of that would have been for naught, because about 1 week ago today, I think things got turned on their heads, and all the experts and all the talking heads missed this one big time. And a matter of fact, some of the information we're going to share is changing as we speak.
Absolutely, Tom. And we've been trying to update as we go on the fly as things come in. But Tom, let's quickly cover the agenda, and then we're going to dive back into more of the juicy details. Well, we'll do a quick intro. Hopefully everyone knows of us or knows us, and we'll cover that shortly. We're going to talk real quickly, Tom, and you just kind of gave a little bit of a sneak peek, some of the national political overview. Then we're going to dive in. And Tom, you're going to really take us through what happened across the states in particular. It's not on here, but it should be. I'm going to cover some of the federal implications, Tom. We're going to talk about sort of the bigger picture of how, this is going to affect education, how you all may want to be thinking about this from an organizational standpoint. And then, Tom, hopefully we'll have time for some Q&A at the end. So, Tom, why don't you introduce yourself, and then I'll introduce myself, and we'll dig into the content.
Perfect. Tom Luna, living here in Idaho. I was honored to be the state superintendent here in Idaho for 2 terms. In Idaho, that's an elected position, and we're going to talk a little bit about those state superintendents that were elected across the country in this election. And also, while serving as state superintendent, I had the opportunity to serve as president of CCSSO. You're familiar with that. That's kind of the National Governors Association for state chiefs, if you will. Served one 5-year term as a governor on the governing board of NAGB, the National Assessment Governing Board, and that's become very relevant with the latest NAEP results that have been put out. Before that, and where I actually met Doug the first time, had the opportunity to serve in the U.S. Department of Education, working directly with Doug, and all of our work focused on supporting the agenda of Secretary Rod Page. And so that's kind of my background, and been a partner here at Strategos for about 4 years, and enjoy the work that we're doing and the support that we provide across the country.
Perfect. Thanks, Tom. And Tom, do you want to say just a word or two on that 3-letter acronym that I put behind your name there? What is SSE?
Yeah, sure. So SSE, Strategos, we have a number of different services, if you will, that we provide any number of clients that fit in different lanes. Some are nonprofit, some are for-profit companies, but SSE stands for State Superintendent Engagement. And what I focus on is working directly with those state chiefs. And as a state superintendent, and then as president of CCSSO, and my work with NAGB, it had the opportunity to work across the country and meet state chiefs across the country, and I've kept those relationships alive. And then as new state chiefs have been appointed or elected, continued to work with them. And so that's the role that I play with Mark Heron and other members of our team, is to provide that access and to state chiefs, and to help them. Every state chief has things that they aspire to. We try to help them reach those things they aspire to.
Perfect. Thanks, Tom. So I'll cover my background real quickly here. So as Tom mentioned, I did spend some time at the U.S. Department of Education. I'm going to go in reverse chronological order, Tom. So I've been with Strategos now for 3+ years. MIS stands for Market Intelligence and Strategy. And that is all about deconstructing the market and understanding what's moving the market, policy, funding, trends, and how to go after that. So what does your go-to-market look like? What is your product market fit? So a lot of times what I'll do is work with clients. We build the roadmap, and then we decide or we figure out that the state level engagement's the way to go. And then Tom, you pick up either with me, alongside, or after me, and help clients engage at the state level. So that's my practice, what I do at Strategos. I spent the prior about 10 years in the private sector with a few different companies you've heard of, like Scholastic Education, Sylvan Learning, and a few you haven't because they've been acquired. I was at the Department of Ed for 4 years, as Tom mentioned. I was Deputy Chief of Staff for Policy, and I also ran an office called the Office of Innovation and Improvement. Yes, there used to be such a thing. It doesn't exist anymore. And then before that, I spent about 8 years on Capitol Hill, about half that time at the Education Committee. I was there during a time when you might remember a law called No Child Left Behind. I'm sure everybody's heard of that. And then prior to that, I was a teacher. So I've been kicking around K-12 education now for over 20 years in different roles and capacities. And excited to dig into this crazy election, Tom. So just want to start here. So the chart on the left is just meant, it's actually from Pew Research. This was done right before the elections. It just shows the different partisan advantages on different issues: the economy, crime, foreign policy, immigration. Republicans tend to fare better on those topics in terms of what voters said they cared about. And then the Democratic candidates, different set of issues. And you all may have heard this along the way: future of democracy, healthcare, abortion, Supreme Court. And then the bottom are issues that kind of, for the most part, split along partisan lines, education being one, energy policy, gun policy. The parentheses, the percentage in parentheses is just how many voters indicated that was a priority. So it's actually thought that was pretty interesting that education had 64% sort of voter attention, if you will. That's, top 3-4 issues, which I guess shouldn't be a surprise, but it's good to see that, people care about education. But Tom, you sort of were touching on this. There was no wave. There was certainly no red wave. You could actually even say there might have been a little bit of a blue wave or counter wave, if you will. And I think that, Tom, one thing that really stands out to me, I'd love your thoughts on this. I don't know if quote unquote wave elections where one party just dominates over the other is really possible right now. It just feels like we're so evenly divided, and when we go through the numbers, you'll see this. But the way the issues break down, which issues, which, voter cares about, just feels like we're incredibly closely divided. And I just don't know if the talk about a red wave was ever realistic to begin with. But Tom, any thoughts on that?
Well, it sure seemed like it, because traditionally economic issues trump most everything that happens when somebody votes, right? And what we've seen in a number of exit polls is that people who even thought that the country, a vast majority of people think the country is going in the wrong direction, but that those numbers still broke towards the Democrats, and we could spend a couple hours trying to figure out why that was, but also, Doug, to your point about a blue wave, I do think when we get down into some of the numbers that happened at the state level, you will see where the Democrats actually gained positions in state legislatures and in governor's offices. So, at the national level, there wasn't the red wave. It seems like it's going to stay about just like it was before. The House is going to flip to the Republicans, but the Republicans aren't going to take over the Senate like was anticipated. The Republicans will take the House, but it's not going to be by near what anybody thought. But at the state level, I think you're going to see some movement actually towards Democrats in a number of states.
Yeah, absolutely, Tom. And I wonder if we are entering an era where historical comparisons just don't mean much anymore. They haven't really for the last few elections, I think, in any real way. And so, speaking of history, my next bullet is, I mean, Biden and the Democrats basically did better than any president, his party or her, well, just his party, during the midterms in the last 40 years. Like, this is completely unprecedented what happened. And what does that mean? At least at the federal level, Tom, divided government. You know, if the Republicans take the House, and we'll talk more about that, but even with a closely divided Senate, it's hard to get much done. And, you know, we'll talk about this, Tom, later, but love your quick reaction now is, you know, you mentioned at the state level, there's been some interesting sort of shifting around about, you know, sort of divided governor and state legislatures. So it feels like, you know, it's more of that than anybody really, you know, kind of just running the table and having every lever of government under their control.
Yeah, and I think again, we've got a slide that'll show this even in more detail, but specifically we call it a trifecta. That's where one party at the state level has a majority in the House, the Senate, and the governor's office. And the Republicans had a huge advantage of that across the country. And the Democrats actually picked up a number of states that are now the Democrats have majorities in the House, the Senate, and the governorship. And you had some governor's races. You know, Tony Evers, our former state chief that we all know well, you know, it was expected that state would go, that he would lose re-election, and it just did not happen in Wisconsin and any number of states. So we'll talk more about that. But that would have created a divided government in Wisconsin, and that people were anticipating, but it didn't play out there. And in a number of states, what was expected, again, just didn't play out.
Absolutely. Tom, you're good at dropping a tease, so we'll get to that in just a minute. But let's start with the governors, Tom. Where did we land? What changed? Kind of break this down for us, if you will.
Yeah, I think you know, there was 36 states that had races, and you see that the Democrats picked up 3. The Democrats picked up 2, and they ended up picking up Nevada. Now Nevada was interesting because where the Democrats won the Senate race, which was actually the race that decided that the Democrats will keep control of the Senate, and in that the same people that voted for that Democrat senator also voted Republican for governor, and the incumbent Democrat lost, right? So you can see people that were dividing their votes, their tickets. And I think we saw that a lot more in this election than in previous elections, where people tend to vote, you know, party line. But on these high profile races in state after state, you saw them split their ticket. And again, you can try to decide any number of reasons for that. And then we have 2 races that still aren't called in Alaska and Arizona. In Alaska, the Republicans leading. Alaska is kind of interesting because the Republican is actually leading by quite a bit, but hasn't reached 50%. And they have what is called vote. You pick 2 people on the ballot, and if nobody gets to 50%, then they go back and look at who your second choice was, and they have a formula that then decides who puts over 50%. So you could have
ranked choice voting, Tom.
Ranked choice voting. Thank you. So they have ranked choice voting. So you have the Republican that is the race hasn't been called because they aren't convinced that he's going to stay above 50%, and if not, then the ranked choice voting comes in, and it could flip that. And then in Arizona, the Democrat is ahead by like 20,000 votes, and so that one's not called either. So you can see how that could also change the way this plays out. We have new governors in a number of states. You see 26 governors were reelected. And in a moment, we'll talk about the impact that will have on appointed chiefs, because governors play a role if a state appoints a chief, it doesn't elect them.
That's a great overview, Tom, and we'll dig into these a little bit more. And you just highlighted the impact on state chiefs. Beyond that, where there wasn't a flip, but just a new governor. So that's the fourth bullet point there. So, whatever happens in Arizona, right? Well, maybe I'm getting ahead of myself here. No, anyway, these are the states that, like Pennsylvania, brand new governor, same party that it was before. Right. So that's important to note when there's change. No politician runs on a platform of, I'm just going to do what the last guy did. So We'll talk more about, even if it's continuity, if there's the same party but a different leader, there's still going to be change, right? And it'll probably be more in the direction of the way it was, but it'll still be change, something new, something to engage in. So even where there wasn't a change in party, there's going to be, more happening at the state level coming out of this election. So let's keep digging in, Tom, and look at state chiefs.
Yeah, and I want to add one thing about the role that governors play, and we'll get to that in a minute because we have some examples. But here's what we do know is that these superintendents were on the ballot. So we had 7. So across the country, there's about 12 state superintendents that are elected. All the others are appointed either by boards or by a governor. These 7 were up for election. Tony Thurmond in California won re-election. In Arizona, Tom Horn, who many remember is the former state superintendent, then ran for attorney general and won. He's served for attorney general for 8 years, and now he's running for state superintendent again. And he's running against Kathy Hoffman, who is the incumbent. That race is just way too close to call. Last time I looked, I think that there was 800 votes or 600 votes between the two, with millions that have votes that have been cast, right? So it's all about Maricopa County for the governor's race. It's also going to decide who the next state superintendent is in Arizona. Richard Woods, the incumbent, easily won re-election in Georgia. The next 4, Debbie Critchfield in Idaho, Ryan Walters in Oklahoma, Ellen Weaver in South Carolina, Megan Degenfelder are all brand new. They've all served in education at different levels. In Oklahoma, Ryan is currently the Secretary of Education appointed by the governor, but now he's just been elected state superintendent of education, so he'll take on that role. Debbie Critchfield in Idaho is the former chairman or president of the State Board of Education, so she's well known and has a lot of credibility going into office. Megan Degenfelder was the chief policy officer in the Wyoming Department of Education. And then Ellen Weaver is very well known in South Carolina as the CEO of the Palmetto Promise Institution, which is a think tank. And one of the things they focus heavily on is improving education. So these are your new, a number of these are going to be your new state superintendents, and being elected, they're constitutional officers. They have more authority and a lot more autonomy than an appointed state chief. So there's an update on the state superintendents that have been elected. Now, here's the impact that governors can have. And I'll just share one example for you. And if you go and Google it, you can find out the names that are attached to this, but this has nothing at all to do with the quality of the state chief. But when you talk about a governor's race and the impact it can have on a state chief, the governor that is the current governor of Kentucky, one of the things he ran on is the first thing he would do if elected governor was to replace the appointed state chief. It has nothing to do with the state chief. It was just the direction the previous governor was going on education. And of course, the appointed state chief is going to carry out the governor's agenda. So that was an important position, right? I mean, it was an important position, and it was an important factor in the race, and it can be in other races. when you're talking about a governor and when the issue of education comes up, who the state chief is matters. And so you see that we have a number of new governors that are coming into office. You can see in 3 states, you have the party has flipped from one party to the other. Nevada has gone from Democrat to Republican. The other 2 went from Republican to Democrat. So you can assume that the state chief there in those 3 states, that there's going to be some conversation in the possibility of a new state chief coming in at some time after January. And then with the other new governors, even if they're staying in the same party, like you said, Doug, a new governor coming in is going to bring some of their own people and some of their own idea and staff, and that could have an impact. And then just to add to this, you currently also have 2 interim superintendents in one in Alaska, one in Mississippi. You add that all together, there's a possibility of 10 state chiefs that could be impacted, and that doesn't include the elected that we just discussed. So it could be a lot of turnover in state chiefs because of these elections, whether it's the state chief that was elected or the new governors that are going to be coming into office.
Fantastic. All right, Tom. Now we get to your trifectas.
Yeah. So this one, as a former state chief, this had more impact on my ability to move my agenda as an elected state chief than anything, because what happened at the national and federal level definitely, had some impact. But when it comes to the policies that are going to impact education at the state and local level, this is where the decisions are made. It's made in both chambers of the legislature, the House and the Senate, and then a governor that has to sign these bills if they're going to become law, or sign an appropriation if it's going to set funding. So when you look at a state that has a trifecta, that means that the House, the Senate, and the governorship are all one party. You can assume that legislation that works through the legislature has a far better chance of becoming law with the same party being in governor than not. And so you look at these numbers, 20 Republican trifectas, you can see those in red. The Democrats have 14, 8 states are divided government, and 8, it's still too early to know. And we updated this slide 30, 40 minutes ago because of more information that came in. So that 8's going to continue to go down, but there's still 8 too early to know, just because of House and Senate seats that haven't been decided, and a couple of governorships that are in Alaska and Arizona that we do not know the outcome. And so the impact of this election versus where we were at is the Republicans did not pick up any trifectas. The Democrats picked up 3 and probably 4 when you look at the trends in Minnesota right now. And then we've gone from 2 states that did not have a divided government to possibly 2 more, Nevada again, when we and New Hampshire, when we see how it plays out in the legislature. So if I'm a company or if I'm an individual that has an appropriation, part of my strategy is an appropriation that I want to work through a state government, this kind of information is critical. If I have a policy that I want to see changed in a state, maybe we want them to be more inclusive of alternative routes to teacher certification because of teacher shortage. Then what is the makeup of the elected officials in that state? And that will help you maybe navigate these waters better. I think we're going to continue to provide updates as we know more, but currently this is the lay of the land. I think this is very valuable information for anybody that's considering doing something at the state level that involves an appropriation or a state policy or law that they want to tweak or put in place.
Fantastic. And just to put in a little plug, you're not going to see this kind of analysis on the trifectas pretty much anywhere else. People don't talk about this enough, but it's one of those nuances that become incredibly important. And one of the reasons, Tom, so, I highlighted the fact that education was kind of evenly split between the voters who said that that was an important issue to them. But Tom, I gotta say, like, when you peel back that onion a little bit further, like, boy, are there divergent views. And so think about it, right? As an organization, if every level of government is in one party's control, the bars that you see that are, pretty significant are going to probably be more of their policy focus, right? Versus if you're a Republican, and where it's divided, they're going to have to probably figure out something in between. So it may be the issues that are kind of in the middle territory here, but divided means kind of curbing the each side, right? And you're looking at the middle. But if you've got every level, Tom, under your control, then you're going to try to, if you're in a red state, look at expanding school choice. I mean, huge right issue. Parents' rights. We heard a lot about parents' rights, and we should talk more about that, Tom. School safety. You've got just a different focus here. And then when you look at the Democratic side, school funding, teacher pay, student mental health. It's pretty remarkable to me just how different, when you break down the education issue, the two parties wind up emphasizing those different priorities within that catch-all of, education is important. But Tom, again, just like the divided country we're in, man, really different view of each of these parties when it comes to the, a handful of issues here. What are your thoughts, Tom, on just sort of what does this tell us, and how do we deal with this?
Yeah, I think that some of this probably isn't surprising, right? Where you see the priorities. It does surprise me, even in red states that, or specifically in red states, that addressing teacher shortage is so low, right? Because we hear it a lot, and it's definitely not a bipartisan. It's having an effect on red and blue states, so that kind of surprised me. One thing that came out in these exit polling also that I think was interesting was that if people that were 45 and under, they broke Democrat. People that were 45 and older broke Republican. So if I'm looking at education issues that impact K-12, I'm assuming that people 45 and under are the ones that have children that are in that elementary, secondary, and probably education is more important to them, and that broke more towards the Democrats. So if I had an issue that was more important to the older generations, then you could see how those states that tend to be red would be more open to those kinds of issues. But if we're talking about education, those states that are blue, you can tell that the younger generation was far more looking at the kinds of issues that the Democrats identify here: funding, teacher pay, student mental health. That was important to the 45 and younger, which tend to be the those that have children that are in school age. So I think that's an interesting connection and can help kind of navigate these waters. I think that it's when I look at a state, especially if it has a trifecta, then I would look and see where these policies line up with the kinds of programs and ideas that I want to bring to that state, and work with the state chief and or the legislature or the governor towards implementing.
Yeah, and this is certainly not every issue that's going to be important. It's just the available polling and what folks were responding to, what the issues were that candidates were talking about. It just is remarkable, though, Tom. 4 of the top 5 Republican issue sort of concerns don't even register on the Democratic side. So it's just fascinating the differences here in particular. And one last topic to touch on in this slide, I think there was a lot of talk and a lot of analysis around Glenn Youngkin's win in Virginia. He really focused on parents' rights. You've heard that talked about a lot. I saw some data, Tom, that when you go down to the school board level, that of the candidates, it kind of broke a third of the candidates who were really talking about parental rights. They won about a third of the time. The candidates who were more aligned with sort of the Democratic agenda, they won about a third of the time. And then the last third were kind of a mixture of two. But it doesn't feel, Tom, and this is a theory of mine, that, you know, as we get further away from some of those incredibly heated battles during the pandemic and right afterwards, that this notion of parents' rights, you know, as espoused by some of the politicians, the governors, doesn't seem to resonate as broadly, because even in the elections last year with Virginia, New Jersey, like a New Jersey governor kind of ran on that platform and came within a whisker of winning. And boy, it doesn't feel like it had the same power in this election. Would you agree with that, Tom?
Yeah, and we even saw it play out at the local level. And I'll just use my own state here in Idaho as an example. A year ago, when we had just even school board races, and then 2 years ago when you had some school board races, but also legislature, those, you know, a lot of conversation about parents' rights and about, you know, who has the ability to close schools, and school boards members were resigning or being defeated at the polls. You had a lot of those same issues that were being discussed this year, but the candidates that were running on those issues didn't fare near as well as they did a year or 2 years ago. And so that makes your point. It's not as big of an issue, and definitely it's not. It's definitely becoming obvious when you see how people voted, and the reason they voted for folks that were running for education positions didn't have as much to do with parents' rights or critical race theory or those types of issues. It was more about career readiness and, you know, is my child going to be, when they graduate, are they going to be ready? How are we going to close this gap, this learning gap that NAEP and other assessments have demonstrated? We have a lot of work to do. That's what motivated school board races, even community college races here and also across the country.
Absolutely. Boy, Tom, things change so quickly. Speaking of changing quickly, let's talk at the federal level for a couple of minutes. Now, there's still some votes to be counted, but pretty much all the major organizations have called, in particular, the Arizona and Nevada races for the Democrats, which gives them 50. Even if the Georgia runoff goes to the Republican, a 50-50 tie, which is what we have now, goes to the Democrats by virtue of the Vice President Harris's tie-breaking role. So there is no scenario short of one of those two races, Arizona and Nevada, that suddenly gets uncalled or flips, which I don't think will happen. So I'm not saying it will. So if we go with this, the Democrats have control of Congress, and we're going to talk about implications of that. Sorry, they have control of the Senate. Let's talk about the House. So, you know, the question was, how many seats were the Republicans going to pick up? And now the question is, how many seats will the Republicans have to have a majority? Tom, a recent article, like literally earlier today, I read, is projecting Republicans at 221, which you need 218 to control the chamber. So that's a 3-seat majority. That is not what anyone expected. It's super razor thin, especially when you consider the Democrats had a 5-seat majority coming into the election. So a flip of 8 seats historically is unprecedented. Like it's especially really midterm. At a midterm, 100%. Now there's 20 races yet to be called, but I will tell you, in reading, you know, New York Times and a few of the publications out there, people seem to think the Republicans will gain control, but it will be razor thin. So let's talk about what this means. So in the Senate, we do have the December 6th runoff with Warnock and Walker. It's more of an exercise in beating each other up than it is control. I mean, obviously Warnock would like to win. We'll see what happens, but here we are again. I thought for a minute that we would have another Georgia runoff determining control of Congress, but not this time. Now, here's kind of an interesting point back to what you were saying, Tom, about, even if it's the same party, there's going to be some changes. So the Senate Help Committee, Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions, Patty Murray has been the ranking or the chair for a long time, but she's now in line to run the Full Appropriations Committee, which is one of the most powerful committee chairmanships or chairs that you can hold. So she's going to, everything I'm hearing is that she will take that, but you can't hold two committee chairs at the same time. So she would have to give up her chair on the Senate Help Committee, which everything I'm hearing, Tom, means Bernie Sanders will be your next Help Committee chair, which is fascinating. We don't really know where he falls on education issues. He's not necessarily been super vocal on these issues. And it really breaks in an interesting way some continuity on that panel because, it used to be Lamar Alexander, then it was Richard Burr, and there's going to be a new leader on the Republican side because Richard Burr retired. There's some talk that the ranking could be Rand Paul. And boy, oh boy, would I love to see a Sanders Paul, throwdown. However, it's likely that Paul will not take ranking, and it might become Cassidy from Louisiana, who's more of a continuation, I would say, from a policy perspective, that Alexander and Burr represented. So we shall see, but we do know there will be a new chair, which is really interesting. And we'll talk about reauthorizations and what that means for policy and funding in a minute. But he's just a big change from Patty Murray. And my last point there on the Senate side, people equals policy is always true, right? Who's in charge sets the policy, and what they believe is going to, shape that policy. So it's really important to know who are the people in charge, setting the agendas, holding the hearings, setting funding levels, all of that. Now in the House, let's talk about that. We think, ? There will be a narrow Republican majority. As I said before, 2, 3, 4 seats, tiny. Now, if the Republicans take control, it's likely that Virginia Foxx will be the chair again. Now, ? on that. One, Republicans may not be in the majority, so we don't know. She's the current ranking member and former chair. And two, she needs to get a waiver to become chair again because each party actually has term limits in place. I think Republicans tend to insist on those a bit more than the Democrats lately. That's not a partisan comment, just an observation. So she'll need a waiver to resume that seat as chair. I'm guessing she'll probably get it, but there's a chance she may not. There's other folks in line. So we'll see, but that seems like the most likely scenario. And then last quick point on the House, with such a narrow majority, it means the Freedom Caucus, meaning the conservatives, and there's a group of, call it 40-ish, 50 maybe, members who would count themselves a member of the Freedom Caucus, a very conservative member. It can only take 7, 6 of them, 10 of them to say no to something to completely gum up the works. So the conservatives are going to have a lot more power to sort of dictate the agenda in the House. But what does that get them? It gets them, something through the House that'll go and die in the Senate, which it usually does, but with divided government, Tom, even more the case. So I look at this, back to my earlier point, yeah, we saw a little bit of change in the House, which is not unexpected, but the Senate could be exactly the same or 1 seat difference. And then in the House, the flip is so tiny that it just feels like we, have a bitterly divided electorate. We continue to have that. So I'm going to keep moving here because we're got a lot to cover. So what does all this mean for federal policy and funding? So if it's divided government, I'm going to use that as my frame because that seems like the most likely scenario. We're going to largely see flat funding then for Title I, Title II, IDEA. There might be incremental increases. President Biden proposed massive increases, and even the House did under Democratic control. But with the Senate so closely divided, where the Republicans are at on education funding, which is generally they're not in favor for more. Again, not a partisan comment, just the way it's been at the federal level. I think what they'll have to do, right, is get to a compromise, and there'll be some small wins here or there. But for regular title appropriations, IDEA, I don't think anything's going away. Nothing's getting cut, so you don't have to worry on that side. But I also don't think there's going to be huge increases. Even though stimulus funding is one block or one square away, let me just hit that. The deadlines, as everyone knows, are coming up for the stimulus funds, ESSER 2 and ESSER 3. There's been a lot of talk about whether those deadlines will get extended. How could they get extended? I think with divided government, that makes it harder to sort of extend those deadlines because it would take some form of act of Congress to sort of affirmatively say, instead of September 30th, 2024 for the American Rescue Plan, you can have another whole year to obligate those dollars. So I think administratively, the Biden administration will have to look to see what kind of flexibility they can provide with the tools that they have. So my guess is, right, because the Republicans, don't forget, no Republican voted for the American Rescue Plan. They've made a lot of noise about the funds not being spent very quickly and whether they're going to be fully spent when the deadlines arrive. And so if they're in the majority in the House, they're going to be looking at this, and it connects back to regular funding because Republicans make the argument that why are we going to give, all this additional money in Title I or IDEA or whatever when they've got all these stimulus dollars left to spend. So those two issues are sort of congealing together. And it should be interesting, but I think the net is we're not going to get a lot of additional federal funding. And I don't think we're going to see a ton more flexibility on stimulus deadlines. Now, I could be wrong, of course, right? Because I would have been wrong a week ago if I'd projected this election. So this could all change. But as of right now, that's where it seems likely to go. I'll hit these last real quick. We're not going to see an ESSA reauthorization in the next 2 years. My gut tells me after the next presidential election in 2024, there will start to be some action. I'm not saying it gets done, but I think you'll start to see a little bit more forward momentum. And the reason is, even though the law was technically due for reauthorization in 2019, is we just haven't had ESSA for long enough because the pandemic stopped everything in its tracks in terms of how the law was being implemented. So I think there needs to be a little bit more time and also an understanding as we restart accountability and assessment, or have restarted. How is that playing out? What tweaks might we need moving forward? How different is the world going to look in the future to make changes to ESSA going forward? So we'll see, but nothing there currently. WIOA is the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act. That got pretty close in the last Congress. If we see education legislation, it will be that. And of course, that's all about workforce readiness and, are we providing enough jobs or folks able to take advantage of the jobs that are available, I should say. So WIOA is a small bill, but I think we could see that. HEA, Higher Education Authorization, or Higher Education Act reauthorization, I should say. We might see some hearings, some action. It's not going anywhere. There's going to be a lot, particularly if the House is in Republican control. Biden's student loan forgiveness will be a hot topic. So expect to see a lot in higher ed, but not necessarily reauthorization. And then lastly, this last point, the oversight and investigation function of Congress. If the Republicans control the House, you can better believe they're going to haul as many Biden administration senior leaders in front of the committees to ask them hard questions or accuse them of whatever they want to accuse them of. So the whole oversight investigation piece, I think, is going to kick into overdrive, which is a necessary function of Congress, don't get me wrong, but there's also a fair amount of grandstanding in that. So it should make for entertaining headlines. But I highly doubt much will come from that other than gridlock or not a lot changing in the short term. So the net at the federal level is, yes, people are changing. Yes, control is changing in the House. At the end of the day, I think what that really means is kind of stasis, where there's not going to be huge changes in one way or the other. And we'll see where we are in 2 years or what the next year brings. But there's not a lot on the reauthorization front except for WIOA. Tom, I know you're at the Department of Ed, you're at the federal level for a number of years, and obviously as CCSSO, they had a role to play there. Any quick thoughts on any of the federal stuff before we move on?
I think I don't want to repeat the things that you said, but I think the most important are going to be these reauthorizations. We waited way too long to reauthorize No Child Left Behind, right? And what I think started off as a good law with great intentions. I was state superintendent, living with that thing for 8 or 9 years after it was supposed to be reauthorized. It just became more of a burden. Yeah, it was no longer helpful. And so I think reauthorization is very critical. Hopefully they don't make the same mistakes they did with No Child Left Behind that was supposed to be reauthorized in 5 years. And I think it was 12 or 13 years later, they finally reauthorized it. That's not, so hopefully we don't have to deal with that, but whether it's WIA or ESRA reauthorization, I think those are critical.
Yep, for sure. All right, real quick, because I know we're starting to get low on time. I mentioned the stimulus funding. Here's a roll-up, couple of caveats. So this is U.S. Department of Education data. It is lagging data. I had hoped that they'd have more recent data, but this is current as of the end of August, so obviously several months behind. It also only shows spending data. So this is not your obligation data around, do you have a written agreement, a contract in place to spend the dollars, but you have not yet spent them. So the difference between obligation and liquidation. Again, an obligation is some sort of agreement, written contract to spend the money. And those are the deadlines that you're familiar with. September 30th of 2022, this year, was the obligation deadline for ESSER 1 under CARES. Now you get 4 additional months to actually fully liquidate those funds. So until the end of January of next year for ESSER 1. Now, each of the laws have that same sort of obligation deadline and then liquidation deadline. So ESSER 2 is September 30th of 2023, obligation. ESSER 3, ARP, is September 30th of 2024. Again, the obligation deadline. The department is allowed a little bit of flexibility on what's called late liquidation, where you can apply to the department and ask for an additional 14 months to fully liquidate those funds. They put out some information on this. They have not yet granted any requests to provide for this late liquidation, but we'll see how that plays out. And if they've done it for ESSER 1, then they'll likely need to do it for ESSER 2 and ESSER 3, but then politics gets in the way because September 30th of 2024 is not that far away from the presidential election. And you can bet if there's a lot of money that still hasn't been spent or obligated from ESSER 3, that's going to be a topic of discussion. High level, right? This is spending data. So these little circles here that you see filled or partially filled or not filled at all is the data that shows how much money has actually been liquidated. Now, CARES Act, that's not surprising, right? It was the smallest amount, deadline just passed. ESSER 2 is coming up next year, still a lot of money left to be spent. And then obviously ESSER 3 is the big one, right? There's still almost $100 billion left to be spent in ESSER 3 dollars. And just to put this into context, on a normal year, the federal Department of Education and Congress obviously sends to the states and districts roughly $43 billion for K-12 education, Title I, Title II, IDEA, all of those. So when you're talking $99 billion left to be spent, that's over 2 times the normal appropriation that a state and district would receive. a lot of money. There's still a lot of money to be spent. These numbers will change, right? Obviously, they'll start moving, but the ESSER $3, the big pot, in my estimation, way behind. And when I looked at the data, Tom, I'll get to you in just a sec, there were 10 states, I think, who had spent less than 10% of their ESSER 3 funds, which means they got to get busy spending money. Go ahead, Tom.
Yeah, I just want a specific point to these dollars. We saw last year, and in legislatures across the country, I think you're going to continue to see it this coming year when legislatures come to town, and that is legislatures trying to lean in and have some influence on how these dollars are going to be spent. Where when the first CARES Act came in, most legislatures weren't in session. So the money came in, the governor started spending it, districts started spending it, and the legislature had little or no influence on how those dollars were spent. By the time these next two rounds of funding came in, the legislature started passing laws and regulation where districts, at least, and in many cases states, would have to get a spending authority. And I think you're just going to see more of that. So go back and look at the slide, or consider what the makeup of these legislatures are as you consider how that could impact districts and states' ability to spend these dollars going forward.
I like how you tied those together, Tom. All right, last slide for everybody. So what is the election impact going to have? We've talked about a number of things here, Tom, but red versus blue, I hate to say it, I kind of wish it didn't, right? But it matters, particularly in the prioritization of certain issues over others, different policies, different funding, different emphasis, depending on the state you're in, whether there's unified control of the trifecta or not, right? We talked about change versus continuity. You know, there's some states where it's more of the same, full steam ahead, right? In other states, there's going to be some level of change, even if it's in the same party. And then lastly, you know, I emphasize, you know, if you're in a red state, school choice is going to be a top priority. If you're in a blue state, more funding of public schools. Now there's variations, right, across all those issues, but those were the two top issues for the different parties. And boy, could they not be different, right? And then, you know, what to track and monitor. And Tom, I'm going to give you the last word here. I'm just going to run through these last bullets. We've talked about this electoral change, new people in place. They're going to want to do things, right? They're going to want to put their stamp on new policies, new funding. So there's going to be a lot of change going on, and it's not going to be necessarily in every case dramatic, but there's going to be change. Learning loss. By the way, we're going to do, Tom and I, along with a special guest who I'm going to tease, that I'm not going to tell you who, but another former state chief is going to join us to talk about NAEP on a webinar that you'll be hearing more about. But these issues around learning loss, SEL mental health, teacher shortage, the shifting consensus on assessment and accountability, and so much more, right? These are going to be top of mind as these new policymakers get into position. And then what does 2 years look from now? I think it looks more different from where we are today than it looks more similar 2, 3, 4 years down the line. I think we're in for some change. Tom, give us the last word. Wrap us up, please.
Yeah, I would just say, you know, we've heard many, many times in the past that elections have consequences. And I think this is going to be a banner year for demonstrating that with the changes that didn't happen at the federal level that everybody anticipated. And then when you drill down and look at what did happen at the state level with legislatures, with governor's offices, and if you want to drill down even further to school boards and state chiefs, there's going to be a lot of consequences because of this election. These things that we've identified as the things to monitor, I think, are going to drive the discussions and the decisions made, whether it's learning loss or mental health, definitely teacher shortage. And then, you know, the whole conversation about assessment and accountability is starting to resurface as we come out of the pandemic, and states are considering what is this next generation of assessments look like? How do we actually measure those things that we have in our accountability system that focuses on critical thinking and problem solving? How can we actually measure that? Those are some of the conversations we see, and a lot of governors talking about career ready and how do we measure that? So I think what you're going to see going forward the next 2 years is going to be different than what we've seen in the most recent past, especially because we're out of the pandemic. But I think it's going to set the stage for what education looks like and focuses on for years to come.
Tom, that's a great wrap up. Thank you everyone for joining us. Again, be on the lookout for when Tom and I and a to be named special guest will join us to talk about NAEP and some of the implications from that as well. So a lot going on. Thanks for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you again next time. So have a great day.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Doug.